on this week's Eastern Conference edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. The trade deadline is still more than a day away, but NHL GMs were in a flurry to get moves done. Count it, 5 deals happening today. We'll break down all that and who's left on the board. We'll get into that and more on this week's Eastern Conference edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this week's March 6th edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, where we have your team every day. We're a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, also available on YouTube. As always, it's the Eastern Conference Battle of Ontario. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me 5 days a week over at Locked On Senators. That's Mike DiStefano over at Locked On Maple Leafs. We had a re-signing today in Philadelphia. We had a trade, multiple, but also one in Philadelphia. They seem like the epicenter, but the biggest move, maybe a 1-for-1, Mikey. We don't see those all too often around trade deadline. The old hockey trade, but we got one today.
Yeah, the Buffalo Sabres electing to trade away Casey Middlestat, going to the Colorado Avalanche for Bowen Byram. I mean, I didn't expect this trade to come along. I had heard, Middlestat, maybe if a team blew their socks off, they'd be willing to move on from him. But ultimately, I don't know. I was a little surprised that Bowen Byram was that knock your socks off type of return. I mean, this team isn't necessarily hurting for like young left shot defensemen. It seemed like a bit of an odd return for a player in Middlestat who's finally turning into that top 6 second line NHL player they thought he'd be when they drafted him high in the first round many years ago.
And that's what I don't understand. It had to be one of those where you're going to have to pay him this summer. He's coming off his bridge deal that was making 2.5, but you put so much sweat equity into developing this player for a matter of 6 years. And finally, he pops off offensively, and that's the year that you're going to move him. It just doesn't make much sense to me. And as a team in Ottawa that's got way too many left shot defensemen, I'll be the first to tell you that when you already have Owen Power and Rasmus Dahlin and Matthias Samuelsson, that's like maybe the last place I would look when I'm Buffalo trying to get better.
Yeah, I mean, we both have that situation in Ottawa and in Toronto. Remember, there was a game last week. The Leafs dressed 6 left shot defensemen, for Pete's sake. It's going to be interesting. I would imagine that they'll look to maybe do some more moving and shaking with one of those guys at some point. Or maybe, someone scoots over to the right side, perhaps. But, Bowen Byram is an interesting player for me. It at least like this season is kind of the first year he's been able to stay healthy. I think that's kind of been what's plagued him throughout his career, because he was drafted, 4th overall a few years back, and he was a very highly touted player coming out of junior, out of the draft, and then just injuries really kind of derailed his career early on and probably hurt his development. But, I think there's still, somewhat of a bright future for him. Like, he's only 22. He had 24 points in 42 games last year, 10 goals, and he's got 20 points, 8 goals in 55 games this year for Colorado. But he's not, he's not getting much power play time, obviously, due to Kyle McCarr. And, I think that he's not being asked to do a whole lot. Now in Buffalo, probably get a bit more of a role, you would think, potentially he could get. And I don't know. I think they're just hoping to try and stock as many talented young defenders as possible. And they decided to make this deal. I do wonder if they had conversations with Middlestat about what an extension would look like. And ultimately they decided it's not going to work. So we might as well get something for him. And Bowen Byram sounds as though, I would imagine, was the best piece that they were offered. Like, why else would you make the trade, right?
Well, Joe Sakic's having himself a day. For me, it's the best day so far, because then he replaces Bowen Byram on the back end by shipping out a first-round pick and a high-salary, low-production player in Ryan Johansson. I know that Nashville ate half of his $8 million, but still $4 million they're able to get off the books. in exchange for Sean Walker, who comes over as a rental, but a right shot blocking, just a complete opposite stylistically than Bowen Byram. So I thought they made out like gangbusters. And the funniest thing is Joe Sakic top 10 protecting that first round pick like his team's not already guaranteed a playoff spot.
Yeah, really. I mean, it was a little bit of I don't know. That was interesting to see that come through, but I thought this was a great trade for them, obviously, and we'll see what ends up happening with Sean Walker moving forward. But I think that they shore up that blue line. They add depth to the right side, which they probably wanted to do, and they opened up cap space while doing it. Like being able to move out Ryan Johansson's the full salary at that, I think was a big move for them. And being able to open up that salary leaves it open for some other moves potentially. Like I think there's something else up Sakic's sleeve. Do you not?
Well, now I know it's a guns race, arms race, whatever you want to call it in the West, because as we're recording right now,
Did you
6:15.
see the Hannafin report?
Yeah. The Vegas
Yeah.
Golden Knights have entered the equation. And usually when Elliot Friedman tweets something like that, it means it's further along than just entering the equation. It means they're probably the front runner.
Yeah. And at this point, not too far. I'm curious what like today is done with the odds on FanDuel. Colorado third now at plus 850. And if you want to look at Vegas, I mean, plus 1300 for Vegas. They had Anthony Mantha yesterday. They add in Noah Hannafin if that's the case. Jack Eichel comes back. Mark Stone comes back in the playoffs. All of a sudden, that Vegas team looks pretty svelte. Do they not?
Man, the West is going to be much more difficult in the first couple rounds. I still think that the East has these top end teams, and we know that the New York Rangers also added Alex Wenberg today. They're not done. The Florida Panthers add Vladimir Tarasenko. I don't know if they're done. They don't have much money to play around with, but they certainly have assets that other teams would want if they are looking to still acquire. And they also have so much flexibility, by the way, after this year. They're up against it this year. They have $50 million in cap space this summer, but only 9 players signed. So they do have a lot of signing to do, but still flexibility. And like to me, the Panthers are still the class, but man, the West, I mean, in the first round, Winnipeg, Dallas, Colorado, one of them's guaranteed to be out in the first round. And that to me is criminal. And then in the West, based on the Oilers' slow start, I know they're pushing. They could supplant Vancouver and be number 1. But if we get an Edmonton-Vegas first round as the 2-3 in the Pacific,
two of those, you're going to have two behemoths out.
Both 2-3 matchups in the Western Conference first round, you could have told me at the start of the season that would be the West final, and I would have believed you.
Yeah, it's the Western Conference is chock loaded with a lot of talent. Hopefully, the East can start making some big deals and start doing some moving and shaking. I think we would all love to see that. Obviously, I am curious though. Going back the other way was Ryan Johansson. You mentioned it. Apparently, he's been waived already by the Philadelphia Flyers. Like, is that someone where if Philly's willing to again retain, a chunk of that? Like at $2 million, Ryan Johansson's got to be a useful piece somewhere, no?
I would think so. Well, we know based on previous history would tell us that John Tortorella is not going to use Ryan Johansson in his lineup. He called him out of shape and lazy last time these two teams when they were in Columbus together. So I don't think that's going to move forward.
Probably not. So like he's already been he's waived. He's already been waived. I'm just curious if another team says, "Oh, we'll take him off your hands if you want to retain half that salary," as opposed to paying the full $4 million, only pay half, and we'll give you like a conditional 7th round pick to take on half of that contract for you. Like, I mean, I think there's got to be teams out there that would be interested in doing that. Like
he's got 13 goals.
Yeah, he's not what he used to be, obviously, the 30 to 40 goal scorer, but he's still got to be a useful piece that anyone could use for if someone needs some depth centerman in their lineup. That'll be interesting kind of to watch over the next couple of days here if he gets flipped again.
And you mentioned Philadelphia. Coming up after the break, we'll discuss the Flyers' busy day because they were involved in that trade with Colorado we had talked about, but they had 2 defensemen on the market, and the other one, they said you're staying put. Nick Seeler. We'll get into that conversation and some winners and losers from 48 hours before the deadline. And maybe I'll ask Mikey too, which team in the East has to do something substantial now that we've seen a few of the chess pieces move around the board? That's all coming up next. You're listening to Locked On NHL, your team every day.
Today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. It's the halfway point in the season, and regardless of where you are in the current standings, I want to remind you that you can win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper. It's the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contest. All you got to do is pick whether studs like McKinnon, McDavid, Matthews, Crosby, anyone in the NHL, and whether or not they'll record more or less in their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in any given game. To win 100 times your bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. You heard me. You can win 100 times your money playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper terms of use for details and locational availability.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, right now, through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on this 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the first date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA is available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC member SIPC is a registered broker-dealer. Welcome back to Locked On NHL, your team every day. I'm Ross Levitan from Locked On Senators. That's Mike DiStefano from Locked On Maple Leafs. Every Wednesday, we've got you covered with the Eastern Conference. Of course, this week, a little bit different with so much chaos going all across the NHL. If you want to dial in on each team, how their trade deadline's going, make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to each of the Locked On NHL shows, because we are local experts on the biggest stories. It is your team every day. Mike, the Philadelphia Flyers really want to get into their whole situation because they're in a interesting spot. If you look at their upcoming schedule, tough. So they kind of see, I don't know if it's the writing on the wall, but they're not going all in this year like we're seeing some other teams. What did you think of the decision to trade Sean Walker and then re-sign Nick Seeler to a 4-year extension at 2.7?
Yeah, which I thought was very interesting. Like Nick Seeler, I think he's 30 years old. Like he's not a young guy. You know, he's been around, but he's kind of broken out over the last couple of years, and he's really found his game under John Tortorella, and so I'm not surprised. He does, you know, play like a towards guy. So I'm not surprised that the coach loves him. I think it made sense to move on from Sean Walker, though. I think they got a price point that they thought was worth it, and they were able to acquire picks and still maybe remain competitive. I mean, it is kind of peculiar that this is a team that is in the playoff hunt, currently in a playoff spot, and are selling off, you know, top 4 defensemen and highly coveted defensemen. That said, I think they're playing with found money at this point. Like most people didn't expect for this team to be even remotely competitive. So the fact that they are where they are and they can still, you know, acquire assets for some of these players, I think is probably a win-win. If you ask me, I don't mind what they did at all. I really, really don't.
They're basically timing everything for Matvei Michkov. They're trying to put themselves in the best position that when he comes over in 2 or 3 years, they'll be ready to go pedal to the metal and
As
win.
they should. As they should.
Yeah, interesting. And they get a first-round pick in 2025. And what's notable about that is Danny Briere said they were very much on it had to be 2025. They've already got 2 first-round picks this year. They still have the Florida Panthers first that they got in the Claude Giroux trade a couple of years ago. And then they've got a second-round pick in the Ivan Provorov trade. Now, they don't have their own trade based on a deal, but they got a compensation pick because they didn't sign their 2018 first-round pick, Jay O'Brien. It's a not often used vehicle in the NHL where if you don't sign a first-round pick, you get a second-round pick in compensation. So
he ended up with the Marlies actually this year.
Really?
Yeah, he signed an AHL deal with the Marlies.
Yeah, well, they're flush with picks going forward, and they also have one of the better prospect pools that's really kind of taken a huge step forward over the years, despite moving on, obviously, from Cutter Gauthier. And, I mean, they still got value at that and young value in Jamie Drysdale, who finds themselves on the IR. I think they might be pulling themselves away from the playoff hunt. If you just look like let me pull this up right here because I'd imagine it's going to be the next, I think 6 or 7 games that are at Florida, at Tampa. Then they come home. I mean, San Jose got to win that one. Then they've got Toronto at home, to Boston, Toronto at home, Carolina on the road, Boston, Florida at home, at Rangers as their upcoming schedule.
That's as tough can be, man.
Yeah.
That's tough. Like, that's all the heavy hitters in the East.
All of them.
All of the heavy hitters in the East. I mean, yeah, I guess, show us what you're made of now at this point, right? Like, that's kind of where you're at if you're the Philadelphia Flyers. Look, I wonder too how much, like, if you're the Devils, and I think the Devils might be that other team that you're thinking, okay, can we catch up to Philly? Like, I think Detroit, Tampa, they're probably good, but can we catch up to Philly? And if you're looking ahead at that schedule, if you're the Devils, you think to yourself, that's going to be a gauntlet. If we go, if we go 5-2, or if we go 6-2 during that stretch, and they go out and they go like 2-5, now all of a sudden, this is a hell of a lot of a different looking standings board, and the Devils have a shot if they can win some games. Which leads me to the next question: is like, do they go after Markstrom? Do they get that goaltender?
Their schedule's pretty hard too. Now they also have a couple, I don't want to call them freebies, but they've got a few winnable games like tomorrow night when they host the St. Louis Blues. Then they've got Carolina at the Rangers, at Dallas, at Arizona, at Vegas, home to Pittsburgh, Winnipeg, Ottawa as their upcoming schedule. So not as much of a death march as the Philadelphia Flyers, but they're going to need goaltending. And it sounds like, according to Elliot Friedman on his 32 Thoughts podcast 2 days ago, which, by the way, the fact that Merrick can just throw out a team name and Friedman has 5 minutes prepared of exactly where they stand is pretty incredible. But basically, the Devils see Jacob Markstrom as their guy. And if they don't get him right now, they're going to try even harder in the summer.
Why not get him now? Get him for 2 runs instead of 1. Like, I don't get what they're waiting for. I really don't understand what they're waiting for. And if you're the Flames, his value will never be as high as it is now. Like, it's not going to be as high in the summer. I truly don't believe that. I think right now he's playing at an elite level, and the Devils, they need it. They are desperate for goaltending. I think they would give up a whole. They've already softened on wanting Calgary to retain money. They're willing to take on the full freight of the $6 million cap hit. Now it just comes down to, well, what's the compensation? And if I'm the Devils, honestly, I am just not necessarily blank check, but it's like whatever they ask for, I'm probably going to give it to them. Probably going to.
Well, it sounded like they'd agreed to terms on something, and then Calgary ownership said, whoa, we might be making a push here to get in the playoffs and have 2 more home dates before whoever wins either conference knocks them out.
Yeah, but with the way that Nashville has gone on this unbelievable win streak, Like it'll be difficult for them to get there. It just will. It's going to be so hard for them to make the playoffs. They would need other teams to kind of fall out of it at this point, I think. So yeah, although they've done a good job of winning some games, the teams ahead of them are winning too. So that's what makes it a little bit more difficult. And I mean, I don't know. I would rather set my team up for future success than those 2 home playoff dates in April. I'd rather set myself up for more than just 2 in 2-3 years from now for getting a haul for Jacob Markstrom.
I'm so intrigued at the Calgary Flames because obviously Noah Hannafin is front of mind for a lot of NHL GMs. And by the way, we have an insider off right now where we mentioned Friedman saying that they're in on Hannafin
Vegas,
of the
Vegas
Vegas
is on
Golden
him.
Knights. And then Darren Dreger goes, as we've reported over the course of the last several days, the Vegas Golden Knights are in on all top players, including Hannafin. Nothing here that's already been established. So we've got a little, insider banter. They love it this time of year. They get so catty. I love it. It's so fun.
So
And go ahead.
Well, so actually, let's take a break and let's look at who's still out there, and then who are the remaining teams that need to pounce. So why do we do that?
That's all next. You're listening to Locked On NHL, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. If you're hiring, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring partner when you need to attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Indeed is the only job site where you're guaranteed to find quality applicants that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay. Instead of spending hours on multiple job sites hoping to find candidates with the right skills, why don't you use the powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all? Indeed partners with you on every step of the journey. Find great talent through time-saving tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. Indeed makes it easy to hire great talent fast. According to ComScore, Indeed is the #1 job site worldwide. So join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Start hiring right now with $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/locked on. The offer is valid through March 31st. Go to Indeed.com/locked on to claim your $75 tax credit before March 31st. That's a $75 credit before March 31st. Indeed.com/locked on. Terms and conditions apply. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. All right, back for Locked On NHL Eastern Conference roundup with the asterisks that it is trade deadline season. So it's where the East meets the West and chaos ensues. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me 5 days a week over at Locked On Senators. We've got the rundown on the Vladimir Tarasenko trade already up and at it. Locked On Maple Leafs. That's where you can find Mike DiStefano. Mike, where would you put the Maple Leafs in the group of, do they absolutely have to make a major move? Do they maybe want to make a major move, or are you comfortable with this team more or less standing pat?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Leafs are in very much like a muddy middle of the two, where it's probably like they would like to make a major move, but I don't think that there's a sense of urgency where they have to make a major move, if that makes sense. Like, I think there are other teams that they probably feel like they have much better chance of winning a championship this year, and they might be 1 or 2 pieces away. Therefore, it makes sense for them to go all in. I'm not sure Toronto's there. And when I look at this trade bait board and the guys who are still available, it doesn't really scream like perfect fit for Toronto. Like once Chris Tanev got dealt to Dallas, he was kind of the one guy that you looked at, you circled and said, that's the perfect guy for the Maple Leafs. And after that, yeah, it's just a bunch of guys, just some, like, there's still some good forwards out there, obviously, but they really need a rugged right shot defenseman. And there's just not really one out there anymore for them to go out and get. They got Ilya Lyubushkin, which I think is a decent, deal for them that they can kind of have in their back pocket. But in terms of there being a stud right shot guy, it's not really one out there unless they get creative and, get a deal done with a player that's no one's talking about, like Colton Parayko's been discussed recently for some reason, as has Adam Larson. If they could pull off one of those deals, all right, I'd be for it. But I think they probably only tinker as opposed to do something big.
Well, part of that too. It's like, are you willing? What about David Savard? What about going to the Montreal Canadiens and asking for David Savard?
Well, it depends what it would take. Like David Savard's not worth a first round pick, so I definitely won't be making a trade if that's the ask there. If they were
Right.
unwilling to trade a first for Chris Tanev, there's no other defenseman outside of Noah Hannafin, who again, Leafs really need someone on the right side that makes any sense to me to deal a first round pick for. So that's kind of where I get a little hesitant when it comes to Toronto and their dealings at the deadline. Unless they go off the board, there's no one worth giving up that type of return for.
Well said. So in the East, we already saw the Philadelphia Flyers make their moves. We discussed that. The Florida Panthers add Vladimir Tarasenko this morning. Who's on the hot seat? Or I should also say, we mentioned the New York Rangers got Alex Wenberg, but they look like they may not be done either. Are like the Boston Bruins a team for you that needs to do something? The Tampa Bay Lightning have been in on a lot of guys, haven't been able to pull the trigger. Who's up next for you that has to make a substantial acquisition?
For me, like we kind of talked about it already with the Devils, if they can get that goalie, I think that would probably be the biggest, like, go out and do that now. But if not Toronto, like where the Carolina Hurricanes at? Like, has Carolina done anything? Like they're kind of waiting in the weeds. There was that report that they potentially could have been in on Elias Pettersson if he was available. So, they're big game hunting. Potentially they're a team who always is in the conversation for best in the East, but, aren't able to get themselves over the finish line. Well, what if they went out and got themselves a Gensel? Or what if they went out and got themselves involved in this, Hannafin sweepstakes and bring him back to Carolina potentially? I think the Carolina Hurricanes is an interesting one. The Rangers, could they make another move to bolster that team and that lineup? The East is weird. Like, it seems like the keeping up with the Joneses seems to be a bit more, seems to be happening more out west with the Western teams than it is here in the East.
It's going to be a fun last 40-ish hours to the deadline, and we'll be here every step of the way, Locked On NHL, where it is your team every day. We've got local experts on all the biggest stories, and we're going into breaking news mode, where when a deal happens, we'll have a local expert with a Locked On NHL host.
The Leafs, Jake McCabe will not play tonight.
I'm hearing because of illness. You think there's a trade?
No, you ruined it. I was having a dramatic pause. I was going to say due to illness. You ruined the dramatic pause.
Did you see, and by the way, Alex Wenberg, who has been since traded, was held out for trade-related issues? I've heard reasons, but trade-related issues. We just can't move this guy.
Yeah, that one was that was an interesting phrasing for sure. Issues, yes, that was interesting for sure.
So in terms of the players that are left on the board, who's the top guy for you?
Well, I think it's definitely, on the blue line, it's obviously Hannafin, and up front, it's Jake Gensel. I expect for both of those guys to get dealt at some point, obviously. And those are the two dudes who really will move the needle. An interesting player who's kind of gotten brought up recently, though, who I think would be a massive addition to anyone who gets him, though, would also be Pavel Buchnevich from the St. Louis Blues. If they can find a way, and I read on Twitter one of the insiders saying that they would be willing to get creative to make the salaries work. I think he's got another year left on his deal after this one. So if they can get creative and make it work with another team, that would be another sizable deal as well, if we could get that by Friday's 3 p.m. deadline.
Oh, yeah, there's still going to be plenty of trades happening. But if you look at TSN's trade bait list from March 5th, just yesterday, you've already
pillaged.
Number 3, Adam Henrique, off the board. Number 6, Sean Walker, off the board. Number 7, Vladimir Tarasenko, off the board. Number 11, Alex Wenberg, off the board. Number 21, Anthony Mantha, off the board. Number 27, Nick Seeler, re-signed, off the board. Number 29, Zach Bogosian, re-signed, off the board. All the happenings are going down here, and all those are in the top 20. There are plenty of guys left, and Sam Carrick was number 42 on this list. He goes to the Edmonton Oilers as well. Edmonton's first round pick is on this. He's gone. It's gone as well. It was actually number 4. So that goes to Anaheim. I know we'll save a lot of that for the Ducks and for the Oilers Locked On, and shout out Locked On Oilers getting a new host. So we're excited to have Locked On Oilers back up and running here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And like, to me, Adam Henrique's just a perfect acquisition for them.
Huge,
versatile,
huge trade.
can play anywhere.
Kill penalties, can be on your second power play, can play down the middle, win you faceoffs. You can play him on the wing somewhere in the middle six. He's a perfect middle six addition. He was someone who I was willing to give up from a Maple Leafs perspective, willing to give up a first round pick for him to be a Maple Leaf. So, Kenny Holland, got ahead of the game, and he went and he made that trade, and now he's an Edmonton Oiler, and they've got some crazy depth down the middle. Crazy depth.
So much. It's going to be so much fun to see this play out in both the East and Western Conference. Next Wednesday, Mikey and I will be back to break down all the moves and to discuss who has put themselves into the best position heading down the stretch. But for now, we'll pass it along to Power Rankings Thursday on Locked On NHL. And in the meantime, let you know that we do have local experts on all the biggest stories. So make sure to subscribe, like the videos, and follow all of the Locked On podcast talent. It's all great people, including my good friend Mike DiStefano over at Locked On Maple Leafs. You can find Locked On Senators as well, where me and Pilsy get things all wrapped up about the nation's capital and a whole lot more. Thank you for watching another edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. We're a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.